He was just a terrified kid. But when he walked into our outlaw clubhouse, he wasn't asking for trouble. He was asking us, the monsters, to be heroes. The air in the clubhouse was thick enough to chew. It was a potent cocktail of stale beer, old leather, and the faint, metallic tang of motor oil that seeped into the very floorboards. Outside, the Arizona sun was beating down on the asphalt, but in here it was perpetually twilight. The only real light coming from the buzzing neon beer signs over the bar and the single cone of light hanging over the worn-out felt of the pool table. The low growl of classic rock rumbled from a pair of ancient speakers in the corner, a constant soundtrack to the clack of pool balls and the gruff laughter of my brothers. This was my sanctuary, our sanctuary, the place where the world and its rules couldn't touch us. I was sitting at my usual spot at the bar, polishing a piece of chrome trim for my bike, when the music seemed to stutter. It didn't actually stop, but a sudden silence fell over the room that made it feel like it had. The laughter died. The smack talk over the pool game ceased. I looked up, following everyone's gaze to the open doorway. And that's when I saw him. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. A small, skinny black kid in a faded red t-shirt and jeans with holes in the knees. He was standing just on the edge of the threshold, 1 foot in the blistering sun, 1 foot in our shadows, looking like a deer caught in the high beams of a freight train. His eyes, wide and dark, darted around the room, taking in the sea of denim and leather, the unkempt beards, the mess of tattoos that covered nearly every inch of exposed skin. He was clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his fist so tight his knuckles were white. He was terrified. You could smell it on him, a scent even more out of place here than fresh-cut flowers. For a long 10 seconds, nobody moved. We just stared. We weren't exactly a tourist destination. People didn't just wander into our clubhouse. You were either invited, or you were looking for a world of trouble you couldn't possibly comprehend. This kid, he didn't fit into either category. Then Grizz, our chapter president, slowly pushed his chair back from the table where he was playing cards. Grizz is a mountain of a man, with a beard down to his chest and a voice that sounds like rocks grinding together. When he stands up, you feel the floorboards protest. He took a slow, deliberate step towards the door, and I saw the kid flinch, but he didn't run. That was the first surprising thing. He stood his ground. "You're a long way from home, little man," Grizz rumbled, his voice low but carrying across the silent room. "You lost?" The boy shook his head, a tiny, jerky movement. He swallowed hard, his little Adam's apple bobbing. He finally seemed to find his voice, though it came out as a squeak. Are you the Hells Angels?" A few of the guys chuckled. Grizz didn't. He just crossed his massive arms over the eagle emblazoned on his cut. "Depends who's asking. Why?" The boy took a hesitant step forward, into the clubhouse proper. He was shaking, but he uncurled his sweaty fist and held out the crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a piece of paper. It was a photograph. A school picture of a little girl with bright eyes and 2 big braids, smiling a gap-toothed grin. "It's my sister," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "Maya, she needs your help. Please, you have to save her." The word "save" hung in the air, heavier than a 2-ton bike. Grizz stared down at the kid, his expression unreadable. Save her from what? We weren't heroes. We weren't the police. We were the guys that good people told their kids to stay away from. We were the monsters in the stories. "Save her from who?" Grizz asked, his voice dangerously soft. "The big kids," the boy said, tears welling up in his eyes now. "They wait for her by the old quarry after school. They take her lunch money. Yesterday they pushed her down and she scraped her knee real bad. They took her locket, the one our grandma gave her before she went to heaven." He was openly crying now, fat tears rolling down his dusty cheeks. "I told the principal, I told my mom, but they just say to walk a different way. But there is no different way, and the big kids said if we tell again, they're gonna really hurt her." The clubhouse was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the greasy floor. The kid looked around at all of us, his gaze pleading. "I saw you guys ride past my street once," he sobbed. "My mom told me to get inside. She said you were dangerous, but you looked like the strongest people I'd ever seen. And I thought, I thought if you're the most dangerous people in town, then nobody would be dangerous to you. His logic was so simple, so innocent, it was like a punch to the gut. Grizz continued to stare down at him, his face a stone mask. For a moment, I thought he was going to laugh the kid right out the door. Tell him to scram, to go cry to the cops. He reached down, and the kid flinched again, but Grizz's hand, a hand as big as the boy's head, gently plucked the photograph from his trembling fingers. He looked at the smiling girl in the picture for a long, long time. Then he looked back at the boy. He crouched down, a feat of engineering for a man his size, until he was almost eye level with the terrified child. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his verdict. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of comfort. His face was grim, his eyes cold as steel. He just looked from the photo to the boy and back again. Finally he stood up, towering over the kid once more. He turned his back on him and faced me. "Stitch," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Get my tools." I didn't ask questions. You don't ask Grizz questions when he uses that tone. I just nodded, slid off my stool, and headed to the workshop in the back. The kid, I noticed, had frozen solid, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. The word tools, coming from a man like Grizz, probably conjured images of chains and pliers and things that belonged in a horror movie, not a garage. I could feel the eyes of every brother in the club on my back as I pushed through the swinging door. I grabbed Grizz's heavy canvas tool roll from the pegboard where it always hung, the weight of the steel inside familiar in my hand. When I came back out, the kid looked like he was about to bolt. He'd taken a step back towards the door, his brave little face pale under his brown skin. Grizz hadn't moved. He just stood there, a granite statue in black leather, watching the boy. I walked over and handed him the roll. The metallic clink of the wrenches and sockets shifting inside was the only sound in the room. The kid flinched at the noise. Grizz took the roll from me without a word, his gaze still locked on the boy. Then he did something none of us expected. He walked right past the kid, over to a dusty corner of the clubhouse where a sad, forgotten little tricycle sat. It had been there for years, left behind by some member's kid who was probably in college by now. One of the pedals was dangling loose. Grizz unrolled his tools on the floor with a heavy canvas thump. He selected a half-inch wrench, knelt down, a process that involved a grunt and the protesting creak of old leather, and started methodically tightening the bolt on the tricycle pedal. He didn't say a word. He just worked, his massive tattooed hands surprisingly nimble. The only sound was the soft squeak, squeak, squeak of the wrench turning. The tension in the room shifted. It was still there, but it was different now. It was confusion. The little boy stared, his mouth hanging open slightly. He watched as Grizz gave the pedal a firm test, nodded in satisfaction, and then slowly began to roll his tools back up. It was a test. I knew it. Grizz was giving the kid a chance to see that we weren't the monsters his mama warned him about. Not all the time, anyway. He was also giving him a chance to run. If the kid cut and ran now, that was the end of it. We weren't chasing him down to help him, but he didn't run. He stood his ground, his fear slowly being replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. When Grizz stood up, wiping a smear of grease on his jeans, the kid finally spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "What's your name?" Grizz looked down at him. "They call me Grizz." "I'm Leo," the boy said, standing a little taller. "All right, Leo," Grizz said, his voice a low rumble. He hooked a thumb towards a vacant chair at his card table. "Sit, and tell us everything. Don't leave a single detail out." For the next 15 minutes, Leo sat perched on the edge of the big wooden chair, looking like a little sparrow on a giant's throne, and laid it all out. He told us there were 3 of them, older kids from the middle school. He gave us their names, Ricky, Jaden, and some kid they called Tank, because he was built like a vending machine. He described the path by the old quarry, a shortcut home that he and his sister Maya had to take because their mom worked 2 jobs and couldn't pick them up. He told us what time they walked by every day, 3:15, on the dot. He told us how they'd corner Maya, how Ricky would do the talking while Tank stood there, cracking his knuckles, and Jaden would just laugh. He even described the locket they stole, a little silver heart with a tiny chip in the corner. As he talked, the atmosphere in the clubhouse changed again. The initial curiosity hardened into a slow-burning anger. These were men who lived by a code, and at the very top of that code, right under loyalty to your brothers, was a simple, unspoken rule. You don't mess with kids. It was the one line you just didn't cross. I saw knuckles whiten around beer bottles. I saw jaws tighten. When Leo finished, his story hanging in the smoky air, Grizz was silent for a full minute. He just stared at the worn-out playing cards on the table, his expression grim. Finally, he pushed the chair back and stood up. He didn't look at Leo. He looked at us, at every single brother in the room. He didn't need to say a word. We knew. He just gave a single, sharp nod. We ride. An engine roared to life, then another, and another. The deep, guttural thunder of 20 V-twin engines firing up in unison shook the very foundation of the building. It was a sound that made the ground tremble, a sound that made civilians lock their doors and pull their kids inside. It was the sound of impending chaos. I saw Leo jump, his eyes wide, but this time it wasn't fear. It was awe. We pulled on our cuts, the leather heavy and familiar on our shoulders. Grizz walked over to Leo, who was now standing by the door, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You wait here with Pops," he said, nodding toward the old bartender. "We'll be back." We swung our legs over our bikes, the heat from the asphalt and the engines washing over us. Grizz was at the front, his chrome handlebars glinting in the afternoon sun. He looked back at us, then twisted the throttle. The resulting roar was deafening. We pulled out of the lot, a rolling wave of steel and leather, a 20-man parade heading for a quiet little quarry on the edge of town. We rode in formation, taking up the whole lane, the sound of our approach announcing our arrival long before we were seen. As we rounded the final bend, we cut our engines, letting the bikes coast the last 100 yards in an eerie, rolling silence. And that's when we saw them. Just like Leo said, a dusty path, the glint of water from the quarry, and a small group of kids. 3 bigger boys and 1 little girl with 2 big braids, her backpack on the ground beside her. She was backed up against a large boulder. We were still too far to hear what they were saying, but we could see the sneer on the face of the kid in the middle. We saw him reach out and snatch something from her hand. We saw her try to grab it back. And then we saw the one they called Tank shove her. Hard. She stumbled backward, tripping over a rock, and landed in the dirt with a cry we could feel more than hear. The sight of that little girl hitting the dirt was like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. A low growl rippled through our ranks, an animal sound of pure, collective rage. Before Grizz even had to give a signal, we let the clutches out. The bike surged forward, not with the roaring thunder of a highway ride, but with a low, menacing rumble, like a predator closing in on its prey. We fanned out, forming a wide, terrifying crescent of chrome and black leather that blocked the entire path. The 3 bullies didn't notice us at first. They were too busy laughing, high-fiving over their latest conquest. The one called Ricky was holding up a brightly colored lunchbox, shaking it like a trophy. Maya, Leo's sister, was still on the ground, crying, clutching her scraped hands. It was Jaden who saw us first. His laughter caught in his throat, and his eyes went as wide as dinner plates. He froze mid-high five, his hand hovering in the air. He nudged Ricky, who turned, his sneer instantly melting into a slack-jawed expression of disbelief and sheer panic. Then they all saw us. 20 large, unsmiling men on motorcycles that looked like they were forged in the pits of hell, all staring directly at them. The biggest of the 3, Tank, who had looked so tough just moments before, actually took a step back, his bravado vanishing like smoke. We coasted to a stop about 15 feet away, a silent, intimidating wall of denim and steel. We didn't get off our bikes. We didn't rev our engines. We just sat there, watching them. The silence was louder than any threat we could have possibly shouted. Grizz was in the center of the line. He slowly, deliberately swung a leg over his bike and planted his boots on the dusty ground. The sound was like 2 stones dropping into a deep well. He didn't rush. He took off his riding gloves, tucking them into his belt, his movements measured and calm. He walked towards the 3 boys, his shadow stretching out long and dark in the afternoon sun, covering them completely. They were paralyzed, trapped between Grizz and the boulder behind them. "That lunchbox," Grizz said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavy. "It doesn't belong to you." Ricky, the apparent leader, was trembling so hard the stolen lunchbox was rattling in his hands. He stammered, We were just playing." Grizz stopped about 5 feet from them. He looked down at Maya, who had scrambled to her feet and was now hiding behind the boulder, peeking out with wide, tear-filled eyes. He gave her a look that wasn't exactly a smile, but it wasn't unkind. It was a look of reassurance. Then his eyes, cold as chipped ice, snapped back to Ricky. "Playing," Grizz repeated, the word dripping with disgust. "You shove a little girl to the ground, you take her things, and you call it playing." He took another slow step forward. "Give the girl her lunchbox." Ricky practically threw it at him. The plastic box clattered on the ground near Grizz's feet. Grizz didn't even look at it. His eyes were locked on Ricky's neck. "I believe you have something else of hers as well. A silver locket. A heart." Ricky's face went pale. He fumbled in his pocket, his clumsy fingers pulling out the small, delicate chain. The silver heart glinted in the sun. Grizz held out his massive, calloused hand. Ricky, shaking like a leaf, placed the locket into his palm. Grizz closed his fist around it, the tiny piece of jewelry disappearing completely. He then turned and walked over to where Maya was hiding. He knelt down again, that same slow, creaking motion as before. "This yours, little one?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He opened his hand. Maya nodded, sniffling. She crept out from behind the rock, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She wouldn't look at his face, just at the locket in his hand. She reached out a small, trembling hand and took it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tiny. "Go on home now," Grizz said gently. "Your brother's waiting for you. He's a brave kid." He watched her for a second as she clutched the locket and her lunchbox and scurried away down the path, glancing back once at the terrifying tableau before breaking into a run. Grizz watched until she was out of sight. Then he slowly rose to his full, intimidating height and turned back to face the 3 boys. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The playful, almost gentle giant who had just comforted a crying child was gone. In his place stood the president of the Hells Angels, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Now," he said, his voice dropping back to that gravelly rumble, "for you 3. He took a menacing step forward, and the boys flattened themselves against the boulder behind them. "We have a problem. You see, you've made a little girl cry, and we don't like that." He pointed a thick finger at Tank. You pushed her." Tank looked like he was about to pass out. Grizz's finger moved to Ricky. You're the ringleader, the big man with the big mouth." Finally he pointed at Jaden. "And you think it's funny." He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting them stew in their own terror. We all just sat on our bikes, a silent jury, watching the trial unfold. "We could do a lot of things to you right now," Grizz continued, his voice dangerously low. "Things your mamas wouldn't even recognize you after. But Leo, he didn't ask us to hurt you. He just asked us to make you stop." Grizz looked them over, a predator contemplating its prey. "So this is what's going to happen. You are going to apologize, not to us, to her. Tomorrow morning you're going to find her, you're going to find her brother, and you're going to tell them you're sorry. And then you're going to be their official escort." The boys stared, confused. "What?" Ricky squeaked. "From now on," Grizz explained, a chilling smile playing on his lips, "you 3 are going to make sure that little girl gets to and from school every single day. You're going to walk with her. You're going to make sure nobody, and I mean nobody, ever messes with her or her brother again. They are now your responsibility. You're their guardian angels." He chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Do you understand me?" They all nodded frantically, their heads bobbing up and down. "Good," Grizz said, "because if we ever hear that you or anyone else has so much as looked at those kids the wrong way, we won't be having a conversation next time." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only the 3 boys could hear. We couldn't make out the words from our bikes, but we saw the last vestiges of color drain from their faces. We saw Ricky's eyes well up with tears. Whatever Grizz said, it had hit its mark. He straightened up, his point made. He turned and started walking back towards his bike. It was over. A clean, simple solution. No violence needed. But as he reached his bike, a car came screeching around the corner, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was a police cruiser. 2 officers jumped out, their hands immediately going to the holsters on their hips. "Nobody move," the lead officer shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Hands where I can see them. All of you." My hand instinctively twitched towards the throttle. A confrontation with the cops was the last thing we needed. Out here, with 20 bikers, 3 terrified kids, and a cloud of dust, things could go sideways fast. Perceptions were everything, and the perception of us was never good. But Grizz, calm as ever, slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, a clear signal for the rest of us to do the same. Engines remained off, boots stayed on the pegs. We were a silent, leather-clad statue garden. The 2 officers advanced cautiously, their eyes darting from us to the 3 pasty-faced bullies still plastered against the rock. The lead cop, a tall guy with a mustache that looked like it was trying to escape his face, kept his focus on Grizz. "What's going on here, Grizz?" he asked, his voice strained. He knew who Grizz was. Every cop in the county knew who Grizz was. "Afternoon, Officer Miller," Grizz rumbled, his voice even and steady. He didn't sound like a man with his hands up. He sounded like a man patiently waiting for a slow bus. "Just having a little chat with these young gentlemen. Community outreach." A few of my brothers stifled a chuckle. Miller's gaze narrowed. "Community outreach? It looks a little more like community intimidation to me. We got a call about a gang of bikers menacing some kids down by the quarry." "A misunderstanding, I assure you," Grizz said smoothly. "These boys were just telling us how they've volunteered to make sure a couple of the younger kids get home safe from now on. Isn't that right, boys?" He glanced over his shoulder at the 3 bullies. Their eyes darted between the cops and Grizz, their minds clearly racing to figure out which was the lesser of 2 evils. Ricky, the ringleader, seemed to make his calculation. The fear of us was clearly more immediate and visceral than the fear of the law. He nodded vigorously. Yes, officer. That's right. We're their guardian angels." As he used the exact phrase Grizz had, his voice cracking on the last word. Officer Miller looked skeptical. He looked from the trembling, stammering boys to the stone-faced bikers. The story didn't add up, but the kids weren't claiming to be victims. They were corroborating Grizz's bizarre story. His partner, a younger, less experienced cop, whispered something to him, but Miller just shook his head slightly, his eyes still locked on Grizz. "And what brought this sudden civic-mindedness on?" Miller asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Before Grizz could answer, a small voice cut through the tension. "They're my friends." We all turned. Standing at the edge of the path, half hidden by a scrub oak, was Leo. He must have gotten worried when we didn't come right back and followed us. Pops, our bartender, stood a few yards behind him, looking anxious. Leo stepped forward, his little chest puffed out, trying to project a bravery I know he didn't feel. "Grizz and his friends are my friends," he repeated, louder this time. "I asked them for help. Those boys," he pointed a small accusing finger at Ricky, Jaden and Tank, "were bullying my sister. My friends just came to talk to them, to make them stop." The whole dynamic of the scene shifted on its axis. Suddenly we weren't the aggressors. We were the cavalry. Officer Miller's face was a study in confusion. He looked at Leo, a small black child, defending a clubhouse full of notorious outlaw bikers. He looked at us, sitting silently on our machines. He looked back at the bullies, who were now actively avoiding eye contact with everyone. The pieces of the puzzle were all there. They just formed a picture that made no sense to him. He let out a long, slow sigh, his hand dropping from his holster. "All right," he said, the fight going out of his voice. "Here's what I see. I see 3 young punks who look like they've seen a ghost, and I see a bunch of you guys. Not doing whatever it is I was worried you were doing. Aye." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Just clear out of here, Grizz, before my paperwork develops a migraine." Grizz gave a slow nod. "As you wish, officer." He lowered his hands and turned back to us. "Let's ride." The simultaneous roar of 20 engines firing to life was a thunderous, defiant sound of victory. It echoed off the quarry walls as we turned our bikes and rumbled away, leaving Officer Miller, his bewildered partner, and 3 very humbled bullies in our dust. We rode back to the clubhouse, not in a tight, intimidating formation, but a little looser, a little lighter. When we pulled back into the lot, Leo and Maya were standing there by the front door with Pops. Maya was holding her locket, and she gave us a small, shy wave as we killed our engines. Leo, however, was beaming, his face lit up with a grin that could have powered the whole town. Grizz swung off his bike and walked over to them. He knelt down in front of Leo, bringing himself eye to eye with the boy who had walked into the lion's den. "You're a good brother, Leo," Grizz said, his voice softer than I'd heard it all day. "You stood up for your sister. That takes courage." "You guys were the brave ones," Leo said, his voice full of hero worship. Grizz shook his head. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what you have to do anyway. You did that today. Don't ever forget that." He then reached into his cut and pulled something out. It was a small, embroidered patch. It wasn't one of ours, not a club patch, but a simple one he must have had tucked away. A roaring grizzly bear. "A little something to remember us by," he said, pressing it into Leo's hand. Leo looked down at the patch, then back up at Grizz, his eyes shining with tears. But this time they were the good kind. He threw his arms around Grizz's thick neck and hugged him tight. For a second the big man froze, surprised, before his huge arms came up and gently patted the small boy on the back. It was a sight I never thought I'd see, and one I knew none of us would ever forget. The monster of our town, the man people crossed the street to avoid, was being hugged by a little kid who saw him not as a danger, but as a savior. And in that moment, in the quiet of our own territory, surrounded by the men I called my brothers, I realized that maybe, just for today, we weren't the villains of the story.